In 1906, a tyrant foreman was fed into a blast furnace by his own crew. The company said he was gone, but for the next 70 years, the night shift found out he never actually clocked out. Tonight, I'm revealing 3 Appalachian Mountains horror stories, documented encounters where the burned man of Sloss Furnaces didn't just haunt the halls, he left survivors with physical scars they couldn't explain. These are real accounts from the people who were there. Names have been changed to respect their family's privacy and their safety. I'm the Shadow Teller. Let the nightmare begin. Have you ever been so tired that you started seeing things in the corner of your eye? You think it's just the exhaustion? You think if you just close your eyes for a second, the shadow will go away. But at the Sloss Furnaces, nestled at the base of the Appalachian Mountains, if you close your eyes, you don't wake up. The steam whistle screamed at 5:30 p.m. To Otis, standing in his cramped company shack in 1921, it sounded like a debt collector banging on the door. He was a man in deep arrears, and the only currency the Sloss Company accepted to keep his family under a roof was pure, unrelenting production. Inside, his daughter, Ruth, lay pale, her breath a wet rattle. The croup. May shoved a lunch pail into his chest, her eyes red. $2 for the doctor, Otis. If you miss this shift, the company store takes the shack. We'll be in the street. Otis grabbed his lucky gloves, heavy leather he'd taken from a friend who died in the pit, and stepped onto the porch. He took a nip of Wildcat moonshine to numb the shooting pain in his back and passed his son, little Silas, who was squatting over a circle of rocks. "I'm feeding Big Alice," the boy whispered, dropping a dead beetle into the center. "She's hungry tonight." A cold knot tightened in Otis's stomach. He understood. In this hollow, if you didn't feed the hunger of the iron, it eventually fed on you. Sloss was a terrestrial hell. Otis stepped into the locker room for his first ever graveyard rotation. The day shift was clocking out, whispering weary jokes, but the night crew was dead silent. Otis ran a thumb over 47 jagged tally marks carved into a wooden beam. He found his mentor, old Silas, looking like wet ash. "Those ain't shifts, Otis," Silas whispered. "Those are the 47 men who forgot to push. The furnace eats what it's owed. Don't look 'em in the eye." Silas shuffled into the fog and vanished. Seconds later, Captain Miller marched past. "Vance, Silas is AWOL. You run this floor solo. Use the new mud gun if you have to." Otis blinked, his cataracts haloing the lights. He knew he'd just seen Silas, but the Wildcat was buzzing in his blood. He wouldn't use that machine. He had to prove he was a better producer than the gears to keep his home. The shift started with the grind. The heat was 120 degrees, and Otis was immediately drowning in sweat blindness. His heavy wool clothes, soaked through, began to chafe his skin raw, a boiled sensation that made the coal dust feel like needles under his shirt. As he trudged through the molding sand, his bad leg dragging, a sharp pain lanced through his foot. He'd stepped on a hot spot, buried iron still smoldering under the surface. It burned clean through his boot sole, the smell of scorched leather rising into the red fog of sulfur. He paused near a stack of rusted molds and heard a skittering sound. He looked down, expecting a furnace rat. But through the shimmering heat waves, he saw it. The creature was the size of a cat, but as it darted away, its front limbs weren't paws. They were pale, tiny, 5-fingered human hands. Otis squeezed his eyes shut. The shine, he thought, his head spinning. It's just the moonshine and the heat. I'm seeing things that aren't there. But then the lights began to pulse, dim, bright. The scent of coal was replaced by burned hair. Clang. A figure in a duster, and a wide-brimmed hat descended the catwalk. Otis felt a wave of relief. Miller had finally sent help. But then the broken pocket watch in his pocket, the one that had been dead since his father's death, began to vibrate against his hip. He pulled it out. The second hand was spinning. Tick, 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 backwards. "I've finally snapped," Otis thought, his heart bucking against his ribs. "The wildcat has rotted my brain. I'm losing time and the world is turning inside out." The stranger stepped into the light, his face a ruin of melted scars. He pointed a gloved finger at the sandrunner. The man growled a single word that vibrated in Otis's teeth. "Dig." The new foreman stood inches away, smelling of a house fire. "Push the steel," the man rasped. Otis worked until his muscles screamed. Finally, the pressure gauge redlined. It was time to tap. Otis reached into his pail and pulled out a scrap of bread for superstitious safety, tossing it into the molten stream. He believed that if he didn't give the furnace food, it would soon take flesh. "Open it!" the man growled. He coughed so hard his vision went black. He coughed so hard his vision went black, and his lucky gloves slipped. His heavy pry bar clattered to the floor just as the molten iron began to hiss from the breach. The man didn't move to help. He just loomed over Otis. "Push!" the man growled. Otis scrambled for the bar. He pictured Ruth's face and swung the hammer with a final scream. The plug shattered. White-hot iron roared out. The man didn't move. He stood in the center of the fire, the liquid metal passing through his legs like water. Otis watched in a daze before the flash blindness took him. The whistle screamed at 6 a.m. To Otis, it sounded like a gavel slamming down. He woke on the concrete as Miller walked in. "Morning, Captain," Otis croaked. "The pour is done. The production is met." Miller looked at the tonnage of iron. "You did all this yourself, Vance? I never got around to sending help." Otis froze. The fella in the hat. The burned man. He drove me all night. And Silas. He warned me. Miller's face turned the color of old milk. "Otis, we found Silas in the locker room at shift start. Heart attack. He'd been dead for hours before you even punched in, and we don't have a burned man on the payroll." Legend has it that Foreman James Slag Wormwood was a tyrant at Sloss who drove nearly 50 workers to their deaths. In 1906, he reportedly fell into the molten iron of Big Alice, though many believe the crew fed him to the furnace he worshipped. Slag never clocked out. For a century, workers have reported a gruff voice screaming, "Push that steel!" and the feeling of being shoved from behind by a Phantom Foreman who refuses to let the production stop. Otis survived that night, but he was just the first to realize that Slag Wormwood never truly left the iron. The city thought the nightmare ended in 1906, but by 1947, a new trio of bosses was about to learn that the burned man had spent 40 years becoming something much more physical and much more violent. Have you ever felt the air in a room change right before something bad happens? Back in 1906, the city thought the nightmare was over when James Slag Wormwood fell into the molten iron and disappeared. It is now 1947, and 3 bosses are stepping into a small boiler room, thinking they are the ones in charge of the factory. But inside the heat and the rising steam, they are about to find out that Slag never really left. He just became the real boss, a man made of burnt skin who hasn't clocked out in 40 years. These are the 3 true stories of men who had to find out the hard way. Vernon. 14 minutes behind the pressure schedule, he muttered, glaring at his mechanical stopwatch. Every wasted minute kept him in the soot, away from his dream of paying for his son's college tuition. He shoved the watch into his pocket and marched toward boiler room number 3. A soot-stained floor worker intercepted him with a greasy clipboard. "Boss, the pressure valve on line 4 failed again." Vernon didn't break his stride. The schedule was slipping. "Yep, sure, thanks for the update," he said, brushing past. "I'm the time motion boss," he thought, irritated. "I didn't ask for any maintenance updates." A few yards down the hall, a heavy steel maintenance door stood wide open. It was a restricted tunnel, always locked. Vernon stopped, peering into the pitch-black, metallic-smelling doorway. Weird, he thought. He pulled the heavy door shut until the latch clicked and kept moving. Footsteps hurried up behind him. The exact same worker held out a fresh stack of punch cards. "Here, boss. The updated shift count for tonight, just like you asked." Vernon took them. "Thanks." His grip tightened on the paper. "I definitely did not ask for this." He turned his back. 10 paces later, a heavy metal latch clicked behind him. He heard the restricted maintenance door groan open, followed by the heavy thud of it slamming shut again. The exact door he had just secured. Confusion prickled his neck, but the schedule pushed him forward into the sulfur-smelling tunnel. Overhead, incandescent bulbs flickered, popped, and rained sparks. The corridor plunged into darkness. A thick cloud of steam rolled from beneath the boiler room door ahead. A tall silhouette stood dead center in the vapor, rigid and unnatural under a wide-brimmed industrial hat. "Hey, that's restricted! What are you doing down there?" Vernon shouted. The silhouette didn't speak. It simply turned and slowly walked left down an adjoining cross corridor, vanishing into the shadows. Vernon shook his head and marched to the cast-iron door of boiler room number 3. He grabbed the bare metal handle. Blistering heat seared his palm. Vernon ripped his hand back with a sharp gasp. Instantly, a violent, invisible impact struck the back of his right knee. His leg buckled. He hit the concrete hard, gritting his teeth against the sudden agony. Cradling his blistered hand, he forced himself up, heavily favoring his left leg. 14 minutes behind. He wrapped his heavy canvas jacket around his uninjured hand and shoved the iron door inward. The tiny brick room swam in superheated vapor. Vernon took 6 heavy steps inside, glaring at his burnt palm, his other hand rubbing his throbbing knee. The heavy iron door violently slammed shut. White-hot sparks sprayed as the sliding latch fused perfectly shut. The temperature spiked. Vernon dropped to his knees, gasping for non-existent air, and the world went black. "Leo!" "Vernon, shift change!" he roared. Years of balancing high-pressure pipes left a permanent ringing in his ears, forcing him to shout. He cracked his jaw, loudly chewing his bazooka bubblegum, his massive 12-inch maintenance wrench comforting in his palm. Tucked in his back pocket was a crumpled seed catalog, his quiet dream of a small farm. Half an hour had passed. Leo headed toward the southeast sector. A few yards down the hall, the heavy steel maintenance door stood wide open. Weird, Leo thought. He shoved the heavy door shut and kept walking. He turned the corner. The regular corridor lights lay shattered. A trail of glowing, smoldering ash painted a path down the center of the hallway directly to the sealed boiler room door. A janitor needs to come through here, he thought, his boots crunching on broken glass. A heavy knock thudded from inside the iron door, followed by a grating scream. "Push some steel!" Leo grabbed the bare metal handle. Blistering heat seared his palm. He yanked it back with a curse, smelling burnt flesh. Jamming the wedge of his wrench into the doorframe gap, he threw his massive weight against the steel. The welded latch snapped like a gunshot. The door swung open. The brick room swam in vapor. Vernon lay motionless on the metal grating. His uniform and burned arms were actively smoking. Leo rushed inside, dropping to his knees over his friend. The heavy iron door violently slammed shut behind him. The impact shook the brick walls, and the world went black. Gene. Tastes exactly like a wet work boot, he grumbled, tossing a slab of mystery meat into the trash. He pulled out a hardware store flyer, his ticket out of Appalachia. A few more months, and he'd trade soot for fresh pine and nails. He pulled out his metal tally pen. Click-clack. The factory whistle blew. Neither Vernon nor Leo had returned. Gene shoved the flyer away. Let me go see what's taking them so long, he thought. He stepped into the corridor. A few yards down, the restricted steel maintenance door stood wide open. Gene peered into the gloom. On a tiny, rusted desk inside sat an unopened pack of bazooka bubblegum and a familiar, crumpled seed catalog. "Vernon, Leo?" Gene called out quietly. Silence. Why are their most prized belongings sitting in a restricted closet? He thought, deeply confused. He pulled the heavy door shut and proceeded. He turned the corner. The regular overhead bulbs were shattered. Dim, flickering emergency lights cast long shadows over a thick trail of smoldering ash leading directly to boiler room number 3. What kind of mess are they doing down here? Gene thought. A guttural voice roared from behind the iron door. "Push some steel." Gene lunged forward, grabbing the handle. Blistering heat instantly seared his palm. He yanked his hand back with a sharp gasp. "Push the steel!" the voice screamed again. Gene pulled a heavy-duty leather maintenance glove from his pocket, shoved it onto his uninjured hand, and forced the iron door open. Heat hit him like a physical blow. In the far corner, Vernon and Leo lay crumpled on the grating. Their uniforms smoked, skin badly burned, both completely passed out. Standing directly over them was a massive silhouette, bleeding thick vapor. Its flesh was burnt, black rock, skin charred and cracking with glowing embers deep in the tissue. The burned man slowly turned its head and looked directly at Gene. Gene's knees buckled under the impossible heat, and his memory collapsed into a suffocating dark. The sterile smell of rubbing alcohol replaced the stench of sulfur. Gene opened his eyes to a buzzing fluorescent light. His chest and hands throbbed, bound tightly in thick medical gauze. He turned his head. Vernon lay in the bed to his left. Leo lay on the right. Both men stared straight up at the acoustic ceiling tiles, pale and hollow. The plant doctors already had their stories straight. They blamed the blast furnace, carbon monoxide poisoning, a massive gas leak that starved their brains of oxygen, inducing a mass hallucination. A clinical Appalachian cover-up for the nightmares born in the dark. Gene's throat felt like sandpaper. "Did you guys hear him?" Vernon and Leo turned their heads in agonizing synchronization. Neither spoke. In the sterile silence of the hospital ward, as Gene looked at the impossible wreckage of their tools, he finally understood that despite their titles and their strict schedules, they were never the ones truly in charge of that plant. Vernon, Leo, and Gene escaped with their lives, but they left their sanity behind in that boiler room. You'd think 70 years of terror would be enough to shutter the plant. But in the freezing winter of 1971, the haunting moved from the shadows of the floor directly into the manager's office. And this time, the foreman was done just making threats. Have you ever watched someone you care about walk into a trap and realize you're too far away to shout a warning? Imagine Milt, sitting 20 feet high in a glass-walled office called the Pulpit, looking down at a factory that is slowly dying. In the freezing winter of 1971, Sloss Furnaces is a ghost town of silent machines and dark corners, lit only by a buzzing desk lamp and the tiny flashlight of the watchman, Artie, moving far below. But tonight, the thick layers of soot and grease on those windows aren't just blocking the view. The black ash is starting to crawl and form heavy, dark shapes that prove Milt isn't the only boss left working the night shift. Milt stared at a stack of pink termination slips on his desk. He bounced a dirty, balled tennis ball against the grease-stained glass. Thwack, catch. Heavy boots clanked up the graded stairs. Artie pushed through the door to grab his heavy time clock. Emphysema rattled the old watchman's chest, leaving a wet, metallic click at the end of every breath. But Artie just smiled and tapped a faded fishing brochure in his breast pocket. Just one more punch, Milt. Then me and Helen are heading for the salt water. Milt slid the pink slips under a heavy ledger. He sent the widower out into the freezing Appalachian night, wanting him to hold on to that dream for just a few more hours. The office door latched shut. Milt settled in for the long haul, turning the glass-walled pulpit into a small, cozy sanctuary against the bitter mountain winter. He poured a steaming cup of black coffee from his battered thermos, letting the rich, roasted scent push back the stale, metallic smell of the factory. He sat down at the desk, shuffled a worn deck of cards, and laid out a quiet game of solitaire. He clicked on his transistor radio. The low, steady rhythm of a late-night blues station filled the room. Milt leaned back in his chair, bringing the hot mug to his lips. But a heavy weight suddenly dropped from the high shelf and slammed onto his chest. Sharp claws dug through his thick coat. The scalding coffee splashed over his collar, burning his skin. Milt scrambled backward, nearly tipping his chair over. It was just the stray work center cat. Nobody knew its real name. Everyone just called it Cat. Milt exhaled a shaky breath, swiping at the hot liquid on his neck. "God dang it, Cat!" he snapped into the shadows. His pulse hammered violently against his ribs from the double shock of the ambush and the burn. This is going to be my last night, he thought. My heart just can't take this. But the brief comfort of the office shattered anyway. The temperature inside the pulpit instantly plummeted, spiderwebbing frost across the windows in seconds. On the edge of the desk, a heavy mag light rolled forward, dropped toward the floor and landed perfectly upright on its flat base. It stood like a silent, impossible monument. Milt snatched his two-way radio, assuming a prank. "You messin' with my gear, Artie?" But static crackled. Artie's voice drifted back, calm and distant. "Nope." Milt shoved the radio aside. The dying building groaned under the ice. He went back to bouncing his tennis ball. Thwack, catch, thwack. He glanced through the soot-stained glass. Down below, a massive silhouette moved near the dormant iron casters. A man wearing a wide-brimmed hat stood perfectly still in the shadows. Layoffs bred desperation, and trespassers often scavenged the scrap. Milt grabbed his heavy coat and began his descent down the metal ladder to the factory floor to kick the man out. But the second his boots hit the concrete, a massive idle generator burst to life. A deafening roar shook dust from the rafters. Milt jumped backward to get away from the roaring machine. His heel caught a lethal, invisible glaze of black ice. Both legs flew out. He slammed onto the concrete, white-hot pain shooting up his bad back. His thick Coke bottle glasses tore from his face and skittered into the dark. The world dissolved into a blurry smudge. Milt groaned, sweeping his bare hands blindly over the freezing floor. Right next to his ear, a booming, gravelly voice vibrated his skull. "Get back to work!" Who the hell is shouting? Milt thought in a daze. I'm the boss here. It had to be a furious, disgruntled ex-worker trying to start trouble. Milt scrambled backward. His fingers brushed cold plastic. He grabbed his frames and jammed them onto his face, ready for a fistfight. But the space around him sat totally empty. Only the shattered right lens of his glasses fractured his vision. Where did he go? Before the impossible disappearing act made sense, the rogue generator erupted. White-hot sparks showered the dark floor in a blinding fountain. This whole place could burn. Milt fought through the spasms in his spine. He limped to the roaring machine, threw his body weight against the giant power lever, and wrestled it down. The sparks died. Milt turned away, panting, ready to limp back to the safety of the pulpit. This is going to be a long night, he thought, swiping cold sweat from his forehead. But a loud, agonized moan cut through the factory. Artie! Milt squinted through his cracked lens. 100 feet away, a massive figure violently shoved the old watchman up a set of metal stairs. Is that a desperate scrapper? Milt forced his trick knee forward, plunging into the iron maze to save the old man. But he couldn't just sprint to the rescue. The casting floor was packed tight with idle, rusted machinery, making a straight path impossible. Milt navigated tight squeezes between massive boilers and jagged gears, his breath burning in his freezing lungs. The factory fought back. Pressurized steam lines shrieked. Boiling white vapor blasted his face, blinding him and searing his cheeks. His bad knee screamed in protest with every twisted step. "Hold on, Artie, I'm coming!" Through the narrow gaps in the rusted metal, the assault continued. Thud, thud. The massive figure rained heavy, merciless punches down on Artie. Milt snatched a heavy iron wrench from a work table. He charged the final clearing at the base of the stairs, screaming a warning. But the massive attacker didn't even wait for the fight. As soon as Milt reached the bottom step, the giant simply stepped backward into a vent of hissing steam and vanished completely. Milt dropped the wrench. It clanged against the iron grates. He dragged himself up the stairs. His battered back spasmed violently, and his trick knee threatened to buckle under his weight. Bruised, exhausted, and half blind, he finally reached the landing. Artie slumped against the railing, his uniform torn to shreds. Milt reached for the old man, bracing for bloody bruises and broken bones. "I'm going to find this psycho," Milt thought, his chest heaving with rage. "He's going to jail. He's going to pay. Let me just get my hands on him." But Artie's skin blistered black. Smoking, third-degree burns stamped his flesh perfectly in the shape of knuckles, branded exactly where the punches landed. Milt froze, his anger melting into pure icy terror. Why is his face burnt? This doesn't make any sense. The attacker was a walking furnace. Artie grabbed Milt's collar. A wet rattle filled his throat. "He told me, no breaks. Get back to work." He plummeted into the 3,000-degree molten. He plummeted into the 3,000-degree molten iron of the Big Alice furnace. An accident, many believe, was a coordinated execution by his own crew. For the next 70 years, his charred silhouette and sulfurous stench haunted the plant, proving that while the machines eventually stopped, Slag never truly clocked out. If you want more Appalachian Mountains horror stories, click here. I'm the Shadow Teller. Stay safe in the dark.